Well, Prime Minister's Questions comes to an end. It used to finish at 12:30. Now we're lucky if it finishes by 12:40, and it's just coming up to 12:40 now, so I guess we can count ourselves as lucky today. And the subject on the table between the front benches, tax, and then a bit more tax from the European Union now moving to try and beef up exchange of information between various territories, to whether HMRC in this country has enough resource to clamp down in tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance, to the role of the overseas territories and crown dependencies, and whether the register of registered companies in these various territories is now going to allow proper investigation by the British authorities. It was all covered there between the two front benches, and then we got to Angus Robertson and we moved to tax again. He raised the issues with his two questions too. It's clearly still the big issue here in Westminster. Before we get some reaction, let's hear what you thought of today's PMQs.
Well, it's still tax. You'll be pleased to know, in that consistent line of questioning and emails. Mike Wilkinson said Jeremy Corbyn started off on a good note, but once he got embroiled in technical detail, he lost his audience. That, in David Cameron's worst period as PM, Corbyn still can't land a decisive blow on him, is quite distressing. David Gray said Corbyn's questions were too long, too complex and delivered in a clumsy way. David Cameron is so much better at thinking on his feet, and he had an easy ride today. But Spencer Salmon says Cameron dodging the questions again. Corbyn a winner by a mile today. And on a different subject, just to move away from tax briefly, this from Gareth, who says David Cameron said he would remain in office to implement the will of the British people in the event of a leave vote on the 23rd of June in response to Douglas Carswell's question in today's PMQs. Total fantasy. David Cameron's position would be untenable in the event of a leave vote, and he'd be gone within the week, either by choice or the advice of the men in grey suits.
He seems to know quite a lot, doesn't he? We may be struggling to keep our jobs if that turns out to be right. I'm going to come on to that because it's an important issue in a minute. But first, Laura, did we learn anything today on the tax exchanges, or was it just more of the same?
I think what we learned actually is just how big an issue this has been, and also how much this has pervaded everything in politics over the last 10 days. We had Jeremy Corbyn, then Caroline Lucas of the Greens and Angus Robertson flow from across the parties, people thinking that this is a bruise that's absolutely worth pressing on the Prime Minister in terms of his own experience in the last 10 days. I don't really think that we learned very much that was new, but it tells us the depth of feeling, and that politicians in the opposition parties believe it's absolutely worth carrying on trying to hang this around the Prime Minister.
In a less adversarial political system, Hilary, Benn, commentators could well conclude that there's broad consensus on what should be done on tax avoidance and tax evasion.
I think there's an element of truth in that, to be honest, Andrew. What was striking was, one, that the Prime Minister did not answer Jeremy's first question about why Conservative MPs been voting against this, and I trust that they'll now be instructed to change their.
Can the British party leader instruct the MEPs?
You might want to ring them up and say, since I've just told the House of Commons that this is something that I support, it might be quite helpful if you would stop trying to obstruct it. That's the first point. Secondly, I absolutely welcome what has been agreed with the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies, apart from the two the Prime Minister mentioned on Monday. But there is a legitimate question, and I raised it yesterday in the House myself. If the British register, which I think is going to come live in June, is going to be available to the public, the register of beneficial ownership, what exactly is the argument for saying to the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies, well, you don't have to do that now, especially when 2 years ago the Prime Minister wrote to them arguing that it should be open. One of the reasons he gave then for arguing that case, it was help to tackle crime. Well, if it's going to help to tackle crime, I think he should press the point on them.
But I understand that, but didn't you get the impression that he thought if he forced that particular point on them, it could delay the whole business of transparency, and that he thought that he had made major progress by allowing automatic access by the authorities in this country, HMRC, the National Crime Agency, Serious Fraud Squad, and so on, to these registers, that you and I may not be able to see them, but the guys that are going and women are going to do all the hard work, they would get to see. They would now have access that they didn't have before, including access to beneficial ownership.
No, indeed, and that's why it is a step forward, in the same way as the European Union, and actually it makes a point that I was arguing earlier. The European Union has just agreed the fourth anti-money laundering directive, which is also going to make things more transparent, including for those who have a need to know investigative journalists. And that is a really good example of how working with our allies in Europe helps us to tackle this problem.
What's your take on this?
I think the hidden hero is David Gauke. I mean, he brought in measures to close 40 loopholes, and I think that brought in, the Prime Minister said, 12 billion. He's looking at another 25 loopholes, going to bring in another 60 million. That's real money. And I think you asked me this bipartisan approach on this. I mean, I think someone told me that Jack Straw's saying, actually, we could have done more in our time. And I think, in fairness, David has done an awful lot on this. What I didn't quite get, I think your point, was why Corbyn was banging on about the transparency. I mean, the Prime Minister, I thought, made it clear that if you push the overseas territories too far on it's all absolutely open for a reason I don't totally understand, they won't play ball. The key thing, surely, is HMRC, National Crime Agency, have access to the books and the information and get people. That's what's really important.
And that'll be a game changer.
Yeah, and I'm totally sympathetic with the Prime Minister's comment. We will be transparent, but if we want all these other overseas territories to play ball, don't push them to the transparency. Just make sure we have total access for our agencies. And I thought that was quite a good point.
Laura, you wanted to come back.
There are two reasons why Labour is keen to keep pressing on this. One, firstly, Jeremy Corbyn has campaigned on these issues for a long time, tax transparency and what happens around the world. So for him, this is one of his core issues. But also they know that what's happened in the last 10 days makes this a vulnerability for the Prime Minister. It even led Jeremy Corbyn to do something quite unusual today, which was to crack rather a good joke at the Prime Minister's expense, joking that he paid more tax than some of the companies around, some people that David Cameron might know quite well did. So for Jeremy Corbyn, this is a good, not easy, but a straightforward political issue, even though behind the scenes there is actually quite a lot of consensus that's meant that progress has been made here. So the accusation that the government's done nothing and sat back and nothing's changed at all in the last couple of years, that doesn't quite wash, but it's a vulnerable political area for the Prime Minister, as we've seen in the last 10 days.
Well, it's clearly been a bruising time for the Prime Minister, not just on this issue, and a whole host of issues, including steel, the budget, and of course the Panama Papers and so on. Isn't there a danger, given the pivotal role the Prime Minister will play in the Remain campaign, that what damages the Prime Minister risks damaging the Remain campaign?
Yes, indeed, because the Prime Minister is the figure who is going to be up front and central in the Remain campaign. That is the way that they are planning to play it. That is how they have been playing it so far. And of course, anything that therefore damages trust in him does damage how much the message that comes out of his mouth how that will land with members of the public who are undecided.
Particularly because he needs to get centrist and centre-left voters.
Indeed, he does.
And
now,
these are not great issues to attract them.
And we understand that there is some nervousness among Remainers, that the message that has been put forward by them isn't landing very well with Labour voters, because it has appeared to be this is coming out of a Conservative Prime Minister's mouth. Therefore, that is a problem for them, that these stories day after day, I mean, there's almost a sort of a retro feel about all of this, however serious these stories really are. We've had embarrassment or perceived embarrassment from Conservatives over financial dealings. We've got splits over Europe. We've got difficulties over an big industrial issue like what's happening with steel. And then today, this story about John Whittingdale. I mean, it's got a sort of touch of the 1980s about it and all of this, but it's definitely difficult for David Cameron. And I would suggest that what we are seeing is the difficulty that Number 10 is having in keeping a grip on the sort of everyday business of government
while running a referendum.
A grip on this biggest political campaign that they've ever had to run.
Sticking with this theme, and then I'll get a reaction to. What was the significance, given that Mr. Carswell, the one UKIP MP, that he knew what the answer would be, because it's the pro forma answer from the Prime Minister, why did he ask him, would he step down as Prime Minister in the event of a Leave vote? Well,
I just wonder if he's trying to prepare the ground for something that I understand is going to happen in the next week or so. Senior figures on the Leave side believe very strongly that if there is a vote for us to leave the European Union, that people who argued on their case should absolutely be involved in the negotiations over the kind of relationship that we have with the rest of the EU and how we depart. They believe that very strongly. They believe that David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor, should not be the only people in charge of those negotiations.
That he'd have to bring in someone like Mr. Gove.
Whether it would be Mr. Gove or Boris Johnson or whomever. But they absolutely believe they would have the right to be round that table if they had won the argument. And I expect in the next week or so we'll hear that argument being put publicly, maybe right now by Owen Paterson.
Well, what do you
but
think,
I wonder
Owen
if that's what
Paterson?
Douglas Carswell was trying to prepare the ground.
What's your view?
Well, I think everyone's got.
Because you said earlier, just to put this in, you said earlier you thought you were going to win, which I was interested that you not, because not so far most Leave people haven't gone that far. You clearly think, rightly or wrongly, that's a different matter. You think the wind is behind you on this. So if it is and you're right, who should do the negotiations to exit?
Yeah, you get away from Westminster, you get away from the London bubble, you get out into the counties, as in Northern Ireland last week. Right. The strength of feet on the ground is remarkable.
I'm not arguing about that. My question was quite specific.
Yeah.
Who should do the renegotiation or the negotiation of the exit terms if you're right?
Well, there will be a mandate. I mean, this will give real strength to the team who are negotiating.
Yeah, but who should do it?
Well, it's got to be people who are committed to us leaving the European Union, getting the power to make our own laws and our own, getting the 350 million back, which goes every week.
So not the Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister has been quite clear all along, and no surprise what he said to Douglas Carswell, he will stay as the Prime Minister. But there's got to be a team who are absolutely committed to leaving the European Union, establishing the UK as an independent country, and taking all the advantage of being the fifth biggest economy in the world.
So by definition, that couldn't include the Prime Minister or the Chancellor, because they're not committed to leaving.
Well, I think there's continuity as well. That's important. I mean, I hope 24th of June, it's my birthday, there will be a great celebration and we will hear...
So it'll be you,
we will hear that we will be leaving. But actually nothing will change on that day.
No, I understand that. No. I simply want to know who...
I do think
anyway,
it's important.
you think the team would have to include Leave
emphatically,
people
have to be a team who are committed.
We're very short of time. Can I just ask you, Hilary, Benn, are you worried that, given that Conservative voters look like they could split 55-45 to come out, so those who remain will need Labour voters to come out, is enough being done to get these Labour voters out?
Well, all the polls show that Labour voters support by majority
that bit I get.
remaining in the European Union. And Jeremy's making a big speech about the case for remaining tomorrow. I think on your original question, which is the position of the Prime Minister, look, I'd like to see him out of office very, very quickly. But the time to do that is a general election. The decision about our place in Europe is for the next 50 years.
My actual question, but I'll give up after this, was, you're getting as bad as him, was, are you happy that enough is being done to get that Labour vote out?
We are doing a lot, and we will be doing more in the run-up to the referendum, because I think, look, once the local elections, the mayorals are out of the way, then people will really turn their attention to the biggest decision we've faced for over 40 years.
I know when to quit when I'm behind. Good. Laura, thank you. You can quit as well.
Thanks,
Thank
already.
you. Just from our programme, that's all.